Thanks, Melinda, and thanks to all of you who ventured out this morning on Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day to you. I'm seeing quite a sea of pinks and reds here, and that's probably a good thing because what we're talking about has everything to do with the formation of our heart, really, today. There are a lot of historical figures in our Christian tradition who've spoken about Christian practices. And one historical figure that I've been reading for a number of years and learning much from is Evelyn Underhill, whose dates are 1875 to 1941. And Underhill was an early 20th century writer. She was a married laywoman, a lecturer, a retreat leader, a spiritual guide. Interestingly enough, she was the very first woman invited to give theological lectures at Oxford. And she was also the first to lead clergy retreats in the Anglican Church. Now, you don't typically find the theological hat and that pastoral, ministerial retreat leader hat in the same person as overtly as you see in Evelyn Underhill. We need more of that. She's known for her wisdom regarding the spiritual life and for coining the term practical mysticism. Underhill writes with really appealing humor about the most serious of things. In one of her books on spiritual life, in which she talks a whole lot about spiritual practices, she states that exercising our spiritual faculty is going to take some attentiveness. It's going to take effort. Quote, if not the renunciation of the cloister, then at least the virtues of the golf course. Ever less interested in definitions of spirituality or definitions of mysticism than in spiritual practices themselves, Underhill believed that we all have this ability to become practical mystics. By cooperating with God's initiative within, something about which she was utterly confident, we are rendered more capable of beholding God while we work in the vineyard. Practical mysticism, in Underhill's presentation of it, involves a union with the flux of life and a union with the real. It means living flung open to the Spirit of God, working tirelessly for mercy, for beauty, for truth, mending what's broken and creating where there's need. Now, becoming this kind of practical mystic, claims Underhill, entails more often than not the simplification of our frequently cluttered characters, emancipation from what is unreal in us, the training of our inner attention, all things which spiritual practices could affect. Underhill refused to think about spiritual practices as things for simply the few, the proud, and the brave. There's nothing otherworldly or pietistic about Underhill's sense of spiritual practices. She says that as we deepen in them, we deepen too in our identification with humanity and the earth. She writes, and I quote, "The riches and beauty of the spiritual landscape are not disclosed to us in order that we might sit in the sun parlor, be grateful for the excellent hospitality, and contemplate the glorious view. Our place is not the auditorium, but the stage, the field, the workshop, the study, laboratory. We are to be agents of the creative spirit in the world." The purpose of spiritual practices, as identified by Underhill, and I dare say the purpose for all of us, is deeper, more integral engagement with the world. Now, spiritual practices are always concrete and particular, specific. They come in all kinds of wondrous shapes and sizes, corresponding with the uniqueness of persons. They're consciously chosen. They're intentional actions that give practical purpose to our faith. Situated between life as we know it and life in all its hoped-for fullness, spiritual practices are imbued with a sense of our relatedness to God, to others, to the earth. Influencing our dispositions and outlooks on the world, spiritual practices render us much more open, inclusive, responsive to the dynamic activity of God's grace. They move us toward greater spiritual maturity. Now, the how-to question regarding spiritual practices is usually people's first interest. Undoubtedly, the how-to question is a good one, and we'll be taking that up today. But ultimately, it is the why question, which is even more primary than the how, particularly over the long haul, when we're interested in maintaining the discipline of spiritual practice. What are we practicing for? I suspect that all of us who are gathered this morning on a lovely Saturday in February, I suspect that we're interested in spiritual practices because we seek a way of life. We want to be more than knowers of a tradition, people familiar with the noetic content of one's faith. We want to be more than simply facile when it comes to the doctrines of our tradition, the moral principles of our tradition. Desiring an embodied faith that changes us, shapes us, molds us, we opt in spiritual practice for a different kind of knowing, a knowing that springs from the heart's core, the lev, spoken about in the Hebrew scriptures as the very center of our affections, Psalm 4, verse 7. The source of our reflection, Isaiah 6, verse 10, and the foundation of our will, 1 Samuel 24, verse 5. Now, the point of spiritual practice is never mastery, and that's not why we're gathered today, to become masters at these spiritual practices. The point is to recognize anew the desire at the center of our heart for deeper relational life, for the kind of living that makes appropriation of our faith much more possible. The wonderful thing is that Catholic Christianity is indeed a tradition rich in practice. Practices that can help us to cultivate inner freedom. Don't we all want to be more open to the movement of God's Spirit with us? Aren't we all seeking greater levels of integration, of right alignment with ourselves, with God, with others, with the earth? Let's begin this day together in a common hope that the conversation that we share, the practices that we break open, that they will be for the sake of enlarged range of vision and fuller spirit. Now, over the course of our time together, and we're going to be together till 2 o'clock today, we'll have a lunch break at 12 noon, we're going to be working in these small tables. So what I'd like us to do at this point is to introduce one another. Maybe you've had a chance to do that, but we've had a lot of people who've just come in. So let's take an opportunity to go right around our table, and maybe by way of introduction, identify a spiritual practice that has formed you in significant ways. All right, let's think about that for a moment. One spiritual practice that you would say has formed you in very significant ways. How it's managed to do that. Okay, let's take 3 or 4 minutes to go right around our circles. All right, let's begin to take the pulse of our group as assembled. And I'm just going to ask perhaps one speaker from each table to volunteer what that practice is that forms them. So we get a sense of what practices are lively already in this group, okay? Maybe we could start with this back table over here. Is there someone who's willing to share with us the practice that has been part of their life that very much forms them? Yes? Thank you. It would help if you stood. Thanks loads.
rosary has been something very special in my family and in my life, and especially I've come back to it over the past 10 years and found that it's a nice way for prayer, for centering, to start with contemplative sort of quiet.
Terrific. And your name is? Eileen. Thank you, Eileen. So Eileen brought up a very rich, age-old practice of praying the rosary, and she immediately connected it with her family, with generations before her, right? Her parents did it, their parents did it. And then its effect on you is it's centering. It grounds you for the day. How about this table in the center here? Anyone?
Rather new. It does not go back generations, but it's the Ignatian examination of consciousness. And I only started it a little over a year ago via a course I'm taking at STM. And I found that it changes my everyday. And I don't know how I managed without it, but I want to promote it among my children. And I'm trying to find ways to make it palatable, which is one of the reasons that I'm here and I'm very invested in looking at spirituality in general.
Well, I have good news for you, Peggy. We will be talking about the examen today. Terrific. Thanks. How about this table over here? Thanks.
My name is Edward. I would like to put together a compilation of what we discussed here rather than just my own practices. There was some reference to appreciating God's world in the sense of a sunset or a seashore or a mountain. Some talked about a practice such as the rosary or the morning offering. And someone else spoke about taking time out from a busy day. Just think about the wonder of God's world.
Thanks, Ed. Very fine practices. How about this table over here? You're all looking at each other. Volunteer your neighbor. It's a great thing to do on Valentine's Day.
Edie Murray. Again, I'll do what this gentleman did. Several things mentioned around the table. Some about being out in nature. Some about connection with scripture and the word. Being in silence. Ignatian spirituality, pieces with that. Silent retreat, so numbers of things.
This table over here, spokesperson.
Good morning. My name is Kathy Long, and I speak for this table, who would say that they had a lot of different meditation practices going on here, and the nature, certainly came in here. One person isn't sure what her practice is, so I hope by the end of the day she can tell us, because I bet it's going to bubble up from within. But my particular practice is centering prayer and Lectio Divina, and I do that twice a day, and it has completely led to a transformation of my entire life.
Thanks, Kathy. Somebody from this table.
Good morning, my name is Ed Kozakowski, and I'm visiting here for a year from Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis, where I've been studying. And for myself, we've had a program, it's been over 15 years at the college church there run by the Jesuits at SLU, of having something called Dialogue of the Word. And it's getting together a group of people. It's always open to folks, adults, young folks, to break open the scriptures for that Sunday and to really try to make sense of it in our daily lives. And we call it dialogue because it's not teaching, it's not structured in that way, but it's really seeing where the words in Scripture move us. And as I was telling the group here, even though we go through the same cycle 3 years apart in that, it's always so very different every time we come back to it in our lives. And it really is wonderful to hear the thoughts and how people are moved by the words in their own particular lives, and how we take it with us throughout the week and come and gather again the following Sunday.
Thanks, Ed. And our final table? Thank you.
Yes, my name is Mary, and we had a variety of people's experience. Several people use daily scripture. I read a book called Celtic Spirituality, and it has
Has to be good.
it is good, and it's usually connected with the natural world. And the other thing that helps me is very similar to this table. I belong to two groups, the People of Promise, where Randy Sachs is our chaplain, and we always have a dialogue homily, and we try to look at the scriptures the day before. And another community called the Spirit of Life Community, and we also have a dialogue community where you might not have anything from the scriptures, but when you come back, people have, given insight where you think, that means a great deal more.
Well, thanks all. What a rich smattering of practices. And indeed, I think it's important to say at the offset that we could be here a very long time if we were going to be exhaustive about our topic today. Unfortunately, we have a limited amount of time, so we have to be somewhat selective. So what I've done is group together some of my favorite, to be honest, my favorite of spiritual practices, and I've grouped them under 3 headings that might prove helpful to us. The 3 being practices of remembering, the second being practices of recentering, and the third being practices of reimagining. And we'll take 2 or 3 under each of these headings today to chat about. And we'll experience some of these as well and have a chance for people in our circle who have some experience with this practice to talk some more about how they engage it. But let's talk about remembering for a bit, because it is such a healthy spiritual discipline. We're off target an awful lot. We're like an arrow incorrectly directed more often than not. And it seems like frequently we carry around a lot of illusions. We're also pretty busy trying to manufacture our own security so much that too gets in the way. So it can be a really healthy thing to just stop and remember. What are practices of prayerful reminiscence that put us back in touch with the God who beckons and leads? And perhaps the most common response to that question is a practice of returning to Scripture. Why do we turn to Scripture? I think we seek to remember again the Christian story in its earliest forms. I suspect we seek to hear its promise, to catch sight again of its vision. And I think that we as contemporary people find some solace in connecting with generations and generations of people who have stayed close to this story and vision. There's something about touching base with their religious experience as expressed in our Christian scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures, that seems very valuable. Many people today would say that they seek to be people of the book, to live by the book. Well, I had a wild and woolly County Kerry Irish grandfather, John J. O'Neill. And Pop O'Neill was such a high-spirited person. And friends who knew him used to ask what he had been up to since the last time they had met, fully expecting wild tales. And he would flash this big, huge grin. He had a big, huge grin. And he would say, I'm simply living by the good book. And it was a response that elicited plenty of dubious head shakes. You see, living by the good book to my County Kerry grandfather involved staying on a straight and narrow path, in accord with those biblical moral precepts. I suspect that is but one aspect of living by the book. I think what we're really after when we seek to pray with Scripture on a regular basis is to be formed by it, to be shaped in ways that will orient our lives. And for Christians, the revelatory power of Scripture lies not in chapters and verses per se, but in the actual personhood of Christ, in encounters with the living God mediated by Scripture. A practice of praying with Scripture enables us to grow in our spiritual lives and grasp more fully God's promise again, because in that promise we find hope. But how do we go about this, praying with Scripture? Well, there are a wide variety of ways. Perhaps the most famous in the tradition is the Lectio Divina approach to Scripture, something a couple of you have mentioned. And the Lectio Divina is an ancient Christian term that refers to a way of reading and praying with Scripture. It's a practice with very long monastic roots, but its time-honored wisdom has come to be known by persons of every walk of life. And in its traditional rendering, a Lectio Divina approach involves 4 movements: Lectio, Meditatio, Oratio, and Contemplatio. Now, it's not important that we know those terms, but let's talk about the dynamic there. The first movement, Lectio, it means a focused reading on a biblical text. And that requires a posture of receptivity. It means listening in with expectancy. People sometimes engage in brief relaxation and breathing exercises before they even pick up the biblical text. And the reason that they do that is to be capable of reading from a more centered down position, a greater place of attentiveness. The second dynamic here is meditatio, and it involves rumination. Thelma Hall, who has written about this approach to Scripture, talks about it as chewing on the Word. Rumination, reflecting on what has been read. It's often done by stopping before a word or a short phrase from the text that is just leaping off the page in its attraction, its attractiveness. It has spoken to us in the context of present life circumstances. The word or phrase that we pause before may be one of comfort, or it might be one of challenge. It could be something that invites us, confronts us, leads us. Whatever, it is a word heard loudly in our reading of a passage, and it naturally evokes associations and memories. And as we chew on this word or this phrase, we ought allow these associations, these memories to surface. They naturally come to the forefront. Staying with them makes us realize that there are strong feelings there too. The third movement of the Lectio Divina approach is oratio, which highlights our interaction with the biblical text as it touches our heart at the level of feeling. So we allow ourselves to really feel what has come to the surface as a result of those memories and associations. And then we speak the prayer of our heart from that place of feeling. The fourth dynamic, contemplatio, is a movement in which we let go of our word or phrase and those associations and feelings that are evoked by it, and simply rest in the sense of accompaniment of God, in the presence of God. Now, that move to contemplatio may or may not be part of our Lectio experience. We don't really manufacture it. We can't manufacture felt senses of the presence of God. But we know that whether or not that fourth part of this approach is there or not, that the prayer is marvelously rich. that the habit of lectio, meditatio, and oratio opens us up in all kinds of significant ways to the lead of God's Spirit within. Now, I thought we might begin this early part of the morning session with the scriptural readings from the day, and that's on a red sheet that's on your table. So if you haven't had a chance to take that now, but don't be looking at the pink one yet, okay? So do we all have the red sheet? Terrific. And what we have there is the responsorial psalm. And we also, Mary Roan and I might take one of those, thanks. We have the responsorial psalm, and we have the gospel for today. So maybe we could begin by finding a more comfortable place in our seats. And maybe we'll share the responsorial psalm together, which is Psalm 90. And so what I'd love you to do first is just to close your eyes for a few moments and to allow yourself to kind of settle down into your body a bit more and concentrate on your breathing. We usually breathe so high and in shallow ways, but allow yourself to move more intentionally into a deeper breath, feeling that inhalation from deep down in the abdomen, and exhaling in slow, relaxed fashion. Conscious of our desire to approach this responsorial psalm with a spirit of expectancy, from a posture of receptivity, let's take a few minutes to read silently this text. Perhaps there's a word or a phrase that rises to the surface in your reading of this text. Let's stay with that word or phrase for a few moments and allow whatever memories come with it we'll give our attention to those. Whatever associations we have in response to that word, we'll bring those into our prayer. And let's imagine that that word or that short phrase is placed right in the middle of our mouth, that we chew on that word and we swallow it, and it drops right down through the body, that we incorporate it into the very fiber of our being. What does this feel like? And pray silently whatever is the most natural prayer from that feeling. And now we let go of our word or our phrase and we simply rest, trusting in the accompaniment of God. And slowly, and as you're ready, we come back to center and open our eyes again to rejoin our comrades at the table. Okay, let's check the pulse of our circle. Let's have a quick conversation and check-in regarding what that experience was like, how it's similar to the ways in which you engage Scripture, what may have been different about it in terms of the ways in which you engage Scripture. We'll take about 3 or 4 minutes at table.